You are listening to the Norton Library podcast, where we explore classic works of literature and philosophy with the leading scholars of the Norton Library, a new series from W. Norton that introduces influential texts to a new generation of readers. I'm your host, Mark Chirino, with Michael Von Cannon producing. Today, we present the second of our two episodes devoted to Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, as we interview its editor, Susan M. Ryan. In part one, we discussed Stowe and her world, her upbringing and works, along with the formidable achievement of this masterpiece. In this second episode, we talk more with Susan Ryan about her experience with this canonical novel, the challenges to reading it, her favorite line, the music it inspires, and so much more. Susan Ryan is professor of English at the University of Louisville. She is the author of The Grammar of Good Intentions, Race and the Antebellum Culture of Benevolence, and The Moral Economies of American Authorship, Reputation, Scandal, and the 19th-Century Literary Marketplace. We're so happy to have her back with us again today. Susan Ryan, welcome back to the Norton Library podcast. It's good to see you, and I look forward to continuing our conversation about Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Susan, I am holding your Norton Library edition. It's an incredibly attractive copy. Can you talk a little bit about this color scheme that the geniuses at Norton have produced?
I love the colors, and they are drawn from or inspired by an 1866 painting by an English artist named Edwin Long. The book was extremely popular in the UK. It's kind of a wild painting, really. It's Victorian domesticity meets Orientalism. So the figure of Eva St. Clair is at the center of the painting, and she's resplendent in white with a gold crucifix. But then the Uncle Tom figure on the right side of the painting is wearing this kind of weird off-the-shoulder wrap, as if he's of a Middle Eastern nomadic tribe of some sort. He wears nothing like that in the book. So it's kind of an interesting painting, but the colors look great. We
have, what would you say, dark green and gold lettering?
Yeah, kind of an intense, like goldy yellow with teal green.
Your discussion of that particular painting, which I wasn't aware of, leads me to ask you about some of the illustrations in the edition. Are these the illustrations in the Norton Library edition? Are those from the first edition of Uncle Tom's Cabin?
Yes, and they're the same ones that are in the Norton Critical Edition. This book went through many, many editions and many translations. It was even translated into Welsh, interestingly enough, and lots of illustrations over time, but then also visual images inspired by the book kind of permeated 1850s, 1860s culture. So there are lots of renderings of Eliza crossing the river, which is not illustrated in this particular edition.
Do you think these illustrations are effective? Do you think they're important for modern readers to look at? Or is there one illustration that strikes you as being particularly remarkable?
I don't know that I've really thought that much about the illustrations in this particular edition. I've thought a lot about the many iterations of Eliza crossing the river, which many of them include barking dogs, which are not actually in the novel, but were part of the stage representations. Some of those visuals of Eliza whiten her considerably, so she looks like a European woman running across these ice floes with this child in her arms. But the illustrations in this edition, I have to admit, I have not thought that hard about.
When did you first read Uncle Tom's Cabin, Susan?
I was probably 11 or 12. I read a lot of earlier American literature. So I read Little Women. I read kind of nonstop. at that age. I did not encounter it again until graduate school, though. It was not assigned in any of my undergraduate English major classes. I think I was in college in the 80s, and it was kind of considered sentimental crap, not good literature. We don't read that sort of thing here. By the time I was in graduate school in the 90s, Uncle Tom's Cabin had become a touchstone for people who were trying to think about race in American culture in the 19th century. This sort of rethinking of sentimentalism was a big part of the critical cultural moment when I was in school. I re-encountered it as a graduate student. My favorite memory of reading this book, I was at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, and I was reading the original serialized version in the National Era, not digitized, on paper. And I cried in the reading room. I was
At what part?
When Eva dies, of course, and her father Augustine is heartbroken, and so I'm crying in the reading room, and I'm simultaneously embarrassed and delighted that this book still works.
You know, I wonder in the 21st century if there are a lot of 11 and 12-year-old kids who are reading Uncle Tom's Cabin, or do you think somehow that's not quite as common as it was when you were a kid?
I would be a little surprised if a lot of 11 or 12-year-olds were reading this book. Of course, maybe I was the only one then, too. Hard to say. I do kind of marvel at the fact that the book has been represented as children's literature in certain ways, because it's pretty dark and violent. I mean, there's infanticide, there's rape and rape threat, not like a fully realized, dramatized rape scene, but evidence of and after effects and trauma from rape. There's a beating death. I mean, it's pretty. It's not really the stuff of children's literature as far as I'm concerned.
Even teaching it to high schoolers or undergraduates who might be better equipped for some of these themes, it seems like the novel might be prohibitively long. Maybe not long as 19th century American novels go, but it's quite a commitment to add this to your syllabus, don't you think?
Absolutely. It's engaging, it's absorbing, but it is long. And probably the most challenging thing about teaching it is the racial representations, the cringe. I don't think I would attempt to teach this book to high schoolers.
Even as a case study for what Stowe was doing in the 19th century and what a massively popular novel it was, and then looking at it critically like that, not for high schoolers. Probably
not. Not least because of the liberal usage of the N-word.
Right.
Which, even at the time, that word had already been identified by African American people and their allies as deeply offensive and to be avoided. So again, this is not just like a 20th, 21st century retrospective on the novel. The word was offensive in 1852, and it's all the way through this book. It's
also the reason why Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is falling off reading lists in colleges and high schools all over, certainly all over America. You mentioned reading this as in a serialized form. Did Stowe write this with serialization in mind, in the sense of like, did she hit dramatic points to keep this a page turner?
It's definitely episodic. In looking through the book again, prior to our conversation, I didn't see as many end of chapter cliffhangers as I would have expected, or is kind of typical in serialization. She tends more to end chapters with like a moment of rest or stasis. Like she's trying not to wear the reader out too much, but readers found it absorbing. And part of the point of serialization was to build an audience and to build a case for a publisher that this is going to be a profitable book. And it definitely succeeded on those registers. In fact, the volume came out before the serialization was finished.
Do you have a favorite line in the novel?
I have a favorite scene, which is the river crossing. I have lived near the Ohio River most of my life. In my lifetime, it's frozen over exactly once. Certainly it's narrower at Cincinnati than it is in Louisville, where I am. But the drama and intensity of that scene, and the fact that, this very Christian, in some ways very conventional woman, is risking not only her own life, but her child's life. She's quite conscious that they both might die, and she is accepting that possibility. Sort of the sudden boldness and physicality of that scene, I think, is really arresting. Eliza kind of fades in later parts of the book, particularly when she and her husband reunite on the journey north. She becomes quieter and more deferential, and you sort of forget this beast that crosses the river holding what had to have been like a 30-pound child. So yeah, that's the moment in the book that I think I gravitate toward the most.
Can we characterize how she writes in the sense of, is she poetic? Is she florid? How would you describe her?
I would say accessible, descriptive. She does a thing that grates with a lot of modern sensibility. She will stop and directly address the reader, which is very typical of mid-19th century fiction. Readers in the 21st century find it a little bracing or artificial or awkward, but she will stop and say, "Reader, have you ever lost a child?" And so those moments kind of remind you of our cultural distance, maybe from the novel. But her powers of description and dramatizing of a scene, it still works. She's very adept at drawing the reader in, pulling those heartstrings, but also commanding attention.
And creating characters with subtlety and complexity?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I say it's not a subtle book, but the characters definitely have complexity.
She's not creating archetypes. She's creating three-dimensional characters.
Yeah, I think that's true. That characters who feel anger and regret and, a full range of emotion. Tom, even though he has not attempted to run away or not attempted overt physical rebellion, deeply misses his family, still wants to get back home, back to Kentucky, back to his wife. The characters are definitely complex.
I know, Susan, you're wearing an administrative hat these days, but when you did teach this, what were some of your entries into teaching Uncle Tom's Cabin to convey it to students?
I always pay a lot of attention to the historical context. So if students don't understand the slavery debates of the 1840s into 1850, 1851, they're not going to understand this book. They absolutely have to understand the fugitive slave law. Not only was that a key inspiration for Stowe, an impetus to write this book, but it figures into the plot. And if students don't really have a good, solid grasp of that, it's not going to make any sense.
So what do we need to know about the Fugitive Slave Act?
So it was part of the Compromise of 1850. It was debated throughout the year. It was finally enacted, I think, in September of 1850. And it basically strengthened laws that were already on the books. But the thing that really offended a lot of white Northerners who maybe had not even been that invested in the slavery issue prior to that, it criminalized rendering aid to a fugitive slave. So whereas before, slave catchers could venture into northern territories to try to kidnap or reclaim someone who had escaped, but the fugitive slave law makes it a crime to give a person a meal who is running from slavery. And people who had heretofore not been particularly invested in the issue suddenly felt that this was impinging on their rights and their conscience. The other piece of it that a lot of people found really offensive was the testimony of, the African-American person being remanded into slavery was not considered relevant. Anything they said about their history or their trajectory or whatever was not considered legally relevant. And there was a financial incentive for judges to determine that someone was a fugitive and send them back. They got more money if that was the decision they came to.
So Stowe was personally outraged by this act.
Absolutely. And she creates a character who's a state legislator in Ohio. Now, he's a state-level legislator, so he wouldn't have been involved in the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, but he has voted on the side of strengthening similar laws. And then he's faced with an actual fugitive from slavery and her child in his household, and he can't turn her in. So he has to kind of confront that.
You mentioned earlier that I always try to lure guests into offering a hot take about their edition. And Susan, I have a feeling you have plenty. Can you offer at least one controversial comment about Uncle Tom's Cabin?
So there's an impulse, if you're editing this book or trying to sell this book, there's an impulse to excuse the book's racism. So Stowe was a product of her time. She was progressive relative to her peers. The fact that she so desperately wanted to end slavery excuses some of these things. I don't buy any of that. In the 1850s, as I've mentioned, some readers were calling out the book's racist stereotypes. It's colorism. It's not coincidental that the escaping slaves with the lightest complexions survive.
Mm.
The figures in the book with dark complexions largely do not survive, with the exception of Topsy. The book's coziness with minstrel show tropes. We have plenty of examples of ardent abolitionists who were also deeply invested in white supremacy. So I think there's this myth that anti-slavery meant anti-racism, which it didn't, or at least it didn't consistently. So the other piece of that hot take, though, is that I think we need to confront the book's racism and we need to read it anyway. Because it's so important to understanding the cultural moment of the middle of the 19th century. And maybe we'll come back to this toward the end of the interview, but I think it still speaks to today's controversies and conundrums in some really interesting ways. So yeah, it's a racist book. Yeah, we should still read it.
So despite Stowe being progressive, she still had views that might be offensive, might have been offensive at the time and might still be offensive.
Absolutely. Chief among them, she had a deep-seated belief in racial essentialism. So she believed that people of African descent were naturally spiritual, naturally religious, placid, community and other-oriented, self-sacrificing, sort of natural Christians. She believed that people of European or Anglo-Saxon ancestry were naturally ambitious, intelligent, aggressive, prone to interpersonal violence, self-promoting. She would not necessarily have endorsed those qualities 100%, but she believed that they were inherent to whiteness. And so her mixed race escaping slavery character, George Harris, is an inventor. He is willing to be physically aggressive when necessary to protect himself and his family. But then she complicates all of that at the end because she has him explicitly choosing alliance with his mother's African ancestry. And that's part of how he justifies deciding to move his family to West Africa. So he's choosing this alliance, even though all the way through the book, she's aligning him with that aggressive Anglo-Saxon kind of thread.
You mentioned in our first episode that almost immediately this novel began to be reappropriated in different forms, more forms than you could even imagine because it was such a popular narrative. Can you talk about some of these adaptations and how some of them may invite us to think about the novel in a different way?
So I've mentioned that there were stage adaptations, musicals, children's books, paintings, lots of silent film versions. There are riffs and references to Uncle Tom's Cabin in cartoons, 20th century cartoons. Those I have not actually seen it. I've seen reference to it. Bugs Bunny apparently disguises himself as Uncle Tom and sings My Old Kentucky Home.
Oh, God.
I'm imagining that that's locked deep, deep, deep in the Looney Tunes vault at this point. There's a Shirley Temple movie called Dimples that kind of riffs on Uncle Tom's Cabin pretty directly. The musical The King and I has a story within a story adaptation of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Gangs of New York has a reference. I looked this up and I can't stop thinking about this. In 1987, there was a made-for-TV movie version of this with Samuel L. Jackson as George Harris and Phylicia Rashad as Eliza Harris. Now, both actors were 10 to 15 years older than the characters at this point. I have got to get hold of this. I've got to see Samuel L. Jackson in Uncle Tom's Cabin.
How many cinematic adaptations have there been about Uncle Tom's Cabin?
I don't know a specific number. In the last 35 years or so, I don't think anybody's wanted to go near this story for visual adaptation, for obvious reasons. The other adaptation I want to talk about is the anti-Tom novels, which is such an interesting phenomenon to me. There were at least 30 of them, mostly published in the 1850s and some into the 1860s. And they're basically narrative responses to Stowe's novel that are trying to show that slavery is actually benign, that the abolitionists are the real villains, that they're coming into the South and creating discontent where there had been none. So my two favorite titles in this corpus, one is Aunt Phyllis's Cabin, which is just so on the nose, it's hilarious. And the other is Uncle Robin, His Cabin in Virginia, and Tom Without One in Boston, which basically gives you the whole story. That the escaping slave is miserable in the North and homeless and freezing to death, and the more placid slave who recognized how good he had it and stayed in Virginia is doing just fine.
Do you see Toni Morrison's Beloved as kind of a descendant of Uncle Tom's Cabin?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Morrison is drawing on a true story of a woman who had escaped slavery and ends up killing her child rather than allowing that child to be returned. So there's a much more immediate story inspiring Beloved, but it had to have been on Morrison's mind.
And there's that river crossing.
The river, the Cincinnati location, it's definitely sort of in conversation with Uncle Tom's Cabin.
I'm also thinking of, and this is an infinite topic, but Richard Wright's Uncle Tom's Children, where as an African-American writer, he's talking about living kind of in the shadow of that, or just what's the effect of such a profound novel. What about music, Susan? Is there an Uncle Tom's Cabin playlist that comes to mind?
Oh my goodness, yes, and it is deeply problematic because it's going to have to include some minstrel show songs. I mean, that was the cultural moment. So My Old Kentucky Home, obviously, Stephen Foster. My Old Kentucky Home is fairly directly riffing on the Uncle Tom's Cabin narrative. There's a brilliant book by my fellow Louisvillian, Emily Bingham, that's about that song and basically unpacks its history and its influence and its, sort of perniciousness in a really interesting way. Also, Protestant hymns, spirituals. If we go a little looser and somewhat anachronistic, Kentucky bluegrass, Delta blues, gospel, but also songs about children, songs about the loss of a child. Eric Clapton's Tears in Heaven I think would work. Brandi Carlile has a beautiful song called The Mother. It's not about a dying child, but the child in the song is actually named Evangeline, the same as Eva in Uncle Tom's Cabin. So that would definitely be on my playlist.
Those are great choices. One of the things that you mentioned obliquely in the first episode that I'm hoping you could talk a little bit more about is the last chapter of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which Stowe titles Concluding Remarks. This seems to be a really important moment in the book. Can you share what's significant about that?
Absolutely. One thing that's significant is it flies in the face of everything we in the 21st century believe about how to end a narrative, because it steps out of the narrative. It's conversational and topical. It's not really part of the story. It's a very strange narrative move in light of 21st century aesthetic expectations, not so much in the 19th century. It's an artifact of the novel's serialization, because by the time she writes Concluding Remarks, she's responding to people who've already responded to the serialized version. So she opens with, people keep asking me if this is a true story. And so she starts talking about some of her sources and some of her inspirations. And these are, of course, themes that she would expand on in A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, published the next year. This is where she talks about having avoided the topic of slavery, but then being motivated, inspired, outraged by the fugitive slave law, feeling that she had to engage. And the whole chapter is trying to move readers toward a similar shift to engagement. If they aren't already there, however many 100 pages in we are by now, what can you do, concerned reader? Now that you've read my story, what's your next step? And she really focuses on this notion of feeling right. This is back to the sentimental strategies of the novel. And a lot of readers, I think, find this politically very disappointing or hollow. I can feel as right as I want to feel, but these people in Tennessee are still enslaved, right? So it's a troubling chapter in a lot of ways. It seems to put a lot of faith in individual hearts and minds. It's not pushing for structural change in the way that a lot of readers might want it to. But keep in mind, women couldn't vote. They could petition legislatures, but they couldn't actually vote for different representatives. So she's working within, the menu of options that she, as a person who's not going to light a building on fire, that she's working with.
The concluding remarks are striking also, and I know this brings both of our episodes full circle, is that it ends on a religious appeal.
I mean, that's the air she breathes. She's a deeply religious woman, and I am not. And I have to shout out to the online keyword searchable King James Version,
right.
Without which I don't think I could have annotated this book.
A lot of your notes are explaining where she's drawing biblical passages from.
Yeah. And for her, she would not have been sitting there with a Bible sort of looking for something that matched. This is all in her head. I mean, she has been reading and thinking about the Bible and applying biblical stories and biblical language to events in her life, current events, political events. That was the air she breathed from early childhood onward.
And that's the note she ends the novel on. And that's the note we're going to have to end this podcast on. Susan Ryan, thank you so much for joining us and discussing your edition of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Thanks so much, Susan.
Thank you.
The Norton Library edition of Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, edited by Susan Ryan, is available now in paperback and ebook. Check out the links in the description to this episode for ordering options and more information about the Norton Library, including the full catalog of titles.